This is Heroes for Freedom with Rick Robinson. Kidnapped from their villages as girls, the incredible true stories of Sally and Sacagawea. About 1825, the renegades, Indian and white, both, surrounded 6-year-old Wye-anna's Shoshoni village in the predawn raid in the shadows of the Wind River Mountains of what would become Wyoming. They sought scalps, and they sought women, as well as young captives that they could abuse and then sell. Sweeping through Wye-anna's village, and she is better known as, actually in her history, as Sally, the raiders killed the men outright, molested, tortured, and murdered the women, and captured a number of children, including Sally. The brutality was unspeakable. But fortunately for my triple great-grandmother, Sally ended up being rescued by a kind-hearted mountain man who was headed back to St. Louis. There she was raised by a compassionate Christian family where she was educated in the ways of the whites. But when she was 15 years old, she continued to long for home. She longed terribly for the mighty Rocky Mountains. So she set off alone on her quest and followed the Missouri River westward, seeking its headwaters, into an adventure that has rarely, I think, been repeated by a teenage girl in the history of any nation in our world. Too often hidden or ignored in America's extremely diverse past, we find amazing, just incredible examples, stories of peoples, cultures, races, and creeds that work together. They work together to build our free, open, prosperous society and nation. Another excellent example, in fact, a full generation before Sally, the Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark expedition of 1803 to 1806, known as the Corps of Discovery. The American expedition to explore newly acquired lands of the Louisiana Purchase. The men of the Corps of Discovery would travel from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, across America's heartland, up the Missouri River, over the Continental Divide to the Pacific Ocean, through the uncharted lands of the great American West. Lewis and Clark, as they moved, they mapped this mysterious continent. They met and they learned from the indigenous tribes and peoples. Studying the plants and animals, they observed much about these western territories. This was all essentially unknown land to the peoples of the fledgling United States. Finishing their journey in 2.5 years, they returned miraculously, alive and well. Many had predicted, many people thought, that they would just simply be swallowed up and never heard from again in this dark wilderness land of the West. But Lewis and Clark expedition, they had a secret weapon. That weapon was a teenage girl. Like us, seriously optimistic Americans, all of us, we have, like we've always done, the men of the Corps of Discovery trusted in their own native grit. They trusted in God, who had never let them down. And in their case, they trusted in an amazing young woman who appeared precisely when she was most needed. In the end, the Corps of Discovery opened a vast continent to first the mountain men, trappers and trailblazers, and initially just a trickle of people came, mostly men, and then by the many hundreds and then thousands and more, bringing their families. Later, settlers and pioneers came from all over the world, but primarily from Europe, who were almost all of them dirt poor farmers with literally nothing to go back to. They trailed the sun westward across these unforgiving lands. Many were immigrants who barely spoke English. In fact, some of them never owned a gun, let alone ever shot one. All of my ancestors, going back 250 years, were among these people. Upon their arrival, they met, actually, my other ancestors, Shoshoni ancestors, who had lived on this land in the West here for thousands of years. Except for the fertile and well-watered Oregon Territory, which of course is beautiful, some areas just incredible, however, most of the West, most of the pioneers that came, found the land to be barren, rocky, alkali soil, forcing them to scrape a living out of the ground with bloodied hands while fighting off wild animals, bandits, disease, and Indians, and burying their children along the way. Thousands, both Indian and white, drenched the soil with their blood. Above all, however, they loved freedom and independence. Beholden to no man, they nurtured a faith in God and a hope that they could grow and prosper as part of this new, providential, promised land. We must remember, however, that none of them would have come for many additional years, unlikely anyway, had it not been for these first intrepid trailblazers. And Meriwether Lewis and William Clark would not have survived without the help and know-how, as we've said, of a Shoshoni teenager named Sacagawea. Sacagawea, also spelled Sacagawea with a J instead of the G, was the child bride of the French explorer Toussaint Charbonneau, who joined the expedition on the plains. Sacagawea, which means bird woman, was Limhi Shoshoni, another Shoshoni. She was taken as a slave at the age of 12 by a Hidatsa raiding party who killed many in her tribe and stole the young women and children, which of course were easier to manipulate and control, and then to sell them as slaves, or to keep them themselves as slaves. The French trapper and explorer, as I mentioned, Toussaint Charbonneau, bought Sacagawea from the Hidatsa and made her his teen bride. She was pregnant when first meeting the Corps of Discovery and Lewis and Clark, giving birth shortly after they met, and as they arrived at Fort Mandan, which is located in the modern state today of North Dakota, along the Missouri. The intrepid Charbonneau decided to join the expedition, so Sacagawea and her newborn son, who was named John Baptiste, went along. It was fortunate she did. She was vital to the success of the expedition. She saved the expedition, actually, several times. Part of the journey would be through Shoshoni territory. She provided translation and interpretation, which are two very different skills, by the way. She interpreted the intentions behind the words of the native bands that they met. She was even given full voting rights with the Corps of Discovery as it moved. William Clark became a sort of grandfather to Sacagawea's son, John Baptiste. He later paid for his schooling in St. Louis and helped him to travel to Europe, where he stayed several years learning French and German. This story, I think many people probably have considered it unique in our history, but in truth, it's been repeated many times, both in frontier times, but also more recently, even in the last century, such as calling upon American Indian tribes to help defeat Japan and the Nazis in World War II. The Navajo Code Talkers, for example, when I got to know some of them in my mission living with the Navajos for 2 years, amazing individuals. The Code Talkers, as an example, saved the lives of countless U.S. Marines. America is an exceptional nation because of such historical events, grounded in Christian compassion and cooperation, but combining so perfectly, so productively with traditional American Indian know-how and grit. Remember, I know this to be true personally from the stories told by my ancestors. My triple great-grandmother, Sally, as mentioned, also Shoshoni, as a teenager married a young mountain man, Elijah Ward, from Virginia. His mentor was Jim Bridger, the famous American frontiersman. Sally and Elijah spent the remainder of their lives helping the pioneers to survive in the harsh Great Basin country of Utah and southern Idaho. For years, until both Elijah and Sally were killed, they died, protecting the downtrodden. They struggled to defend both cultures, Indian and white, trying desperately to find common ground between the two. They were not agitators or protesters, although they certainly at times were victims of those around them, yes. Engaging in such divisive behavior, however, as protesting or rebelling would never have crossed their minds, though we know from family journals that they certainly did have legitimate grievances. But they were often discriminated against, and they were abused and disrespected by the newcomers that they were trying to help. But to their credit, Sally and Elijah seemed to understand that you counter ignorance and discrimination by becoming bridge builders and helpers. You rescue those in need, and you offer peace and friendship. That is the key. During their lives among both Indian and white, they experienced hatred, bloodshed, and war. They understood war and risked everything to try to prevent it. In the end, they made a difference, an incredible difference, really, because they had something of value to offer. Not because of some mandated program to include them because of the color of their skin or because they were victims. Grounded in honor and truth, Sally and Elijah would have rejected something so dishonest, so patronizing. More so, they would have seen it for what it is, a political ruse invented to corrupt, then co-opt and recruit, and finally to control the people it claims to want to help. In reported words, President Lyndon Johnson, when he was rolling out the massive Great Society welfare program in the 1960s, he said, referring to the black vote, "We'll have them voting Democrat for 200 years," unquote. You know, I love the wisdom and wit of Ronald Reagan. He said, "The 9 most terrifying words ever spoken in the English language are this." He said, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." In truth, our world today, we have way too many exploiters, agitators, and social justice supposed warriors. That's not what Sacagawea or Sally or Elijah were ever about. They spent their lives, they were short lives, helping others, healing others, loving others, and leading and leaving a legacy that was the strength and virtue upon which this great nation was built. They were honest American heroes, true heroes, making genuine contributions that actually bettered people's lives. Today, more than ever, we need such service-oriented bridge builders and rescuers. Indeed, the lack of such, I believe, is killing the no longer united states. Identity politics, which is sweeping our land today, driven by the forces of secular moral relativism, is not what Christ taught. In truth, these are desolating political movements based upon intersectionality and critical theory, which are both grounded in cultural Marxism. That's a proven fact. And in fact, also, they are anti-Christ. And again, that's why it's essential we teach our children about the self-sacrificing, noble, and great ones of our past, to emulate their lives of service and sacrifice, to reach down deep and embrace their unyielding courage and faith. Certainly, without a doubt, it's what our children lack today, this wisdom, the living examples of heroes and heroines past, to prove by their lives that men and women were designed from the beginning by a loving God to succeed victoriously, not to crumble in discouragement. To make this work, we love our neighbors as ourselves. We do this by rejecting envy and covetousness. Nothing destroys a civilization faster than living by jealousy and by shouldering the mantle of victimhood. In the words of the great Roman philosopher and statesman Cicero, he said, quote, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. For what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the lives of our ancestors by the sacred records of history," unquote. What can I say to that? But amen. And thank you for your time. I'm Rick Robison, and this is the Heroes for Freedom podcast.